Hi, everybody. We're back with our last reading of the semester. This is The Tempest, and they've changed the format a little bit here, so I can't show as much of the text at one moment. But so, listen, The Tempest was Shakespeare's one of Shakespeare's last plays. We used to think it was his last play. It's a romance. That doesn't mean it's particularly romantic. It means it has to have certain elements in it, like shipwreck and adventure and things like that. And that is the way this play begins. It begins with a big kind of combustible scene with a ship that is sprawling on the seas and about to crack and split apart. It's the waves are horrible. The wind is blowing fiercely. There's thunder. There's lightning. It's really under siege. And you have several characters on the boat. You begin with the master and the bosun who are trying to do their job and keep the ship afloat. And meanwhile, you have these upper class people. You have Alonso, who's the king of Naples, his brother, Sebastian, and Antonio, who was the brother to Prospero, we will find out, but also the Duke of Milan, and Ferdinand, who is the prince of of Naples. He's the son of Alonso. And then there's Gonzalo, this sort of old counselor character. And they are sailing from northern Africa, having just delivered Ferdinand's sister, Claribel, to marry the king of Tunis. And on their way back across the Mediterranean, they have this terrible storm. And during the storm, they're worried and they're kind of harassing the bosun and the master about doing their job the right way. You get a sense of this kind of tension of the classes. And, Gonzalo says, I don't think we're going to die on this ship because this man, the bosun, he has no drowning mark upon him. His complexion is perfect gallows, meaning he will hang because he's a kind of criminal sort of character. So most of this scene is about the frustration of the nobleman trying to make sure the ship is safe, but not really being able to do anything because they're not sailors. So meanwhile, it gets kind of frantic towards the end of this scene. You hear people saying, "Mercy, we split, farewell." Normally, this on stage is kind of a lot of lighting effects and people rolling around and moving and landing on each other. And that scene ends. The next scene is a kind of transformation where this is Shakespeare very interestingly sort of switching perspective. So first you're watching the people on the ship, and then it's like you do a 180 spin to where now you're watching Miranda and Prospero, who are watching the shipwreck from the island. And she sees this shipwreck happening, and she feels very sorry for them. They live on a deserted island somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean. And she says, if by your art, my dearest father, you have put the wild waters in this roar, allay them. And so you get a clue to the power of Prospero, the main character of the play, right from the outset. She suggests, has the ability to cause the storm. So who is he and what is his art and what kind of power does he have? She feels very sorry for the people with who she's seen on the ship. And she says, a brave vessel who had no doubt some noble creature in her dashed all to pieces. Oh, the cry did knock against my very heart. So you get her as this very kind of emotionally connected character, very empathetic. Prospero says, look, be collected, no more amazement. Tell your piteous heart there's no harm done. And he's trying to allay her fears. He's her father. And he says, listen, there's no harm to these people. Everything I did for you, and you don't even really know who you are. And now I need to tell you. Um, and he says, 'tis time I should inform thee farther, lend thy hand and pluck my magic garment from me. So you know that he has some sort of power in this when he puts on this robe. Um, and He explains the history of how he and Miranda came to this island. Now, it's important to notice that he's very controlling of how she listens to this story. He's frequently saying, are you listening? Make sure you're listening to me. Pay attention. He asks what she can remember um, from the time she was 3 years old. And she says, not much, but I kind of feel like I had 4 or 5 women that attended me. And he says, thou hadst, Miranda, and more. But how is it that this lives in thy mind? He's amazed that she can remember that, asks her if she can remember more, and she says no. And then he explains, well, 12 years since, Miranda, 12 years since, thy father was the Duke of Milan and a prince of power. So now she has this moment where she thinks, are you not my father? Because I know you're not the Duke of Milan. And he says, no, that I think your mother was virtuous and I was the father and you're the only heir. And she says, well, what foul play had we that we came here? And then he explains that her uncle and his brother, Antonio, um, and he says, I pray thee, mark me, that a brother should be so perfidious, so awful. He whom I loved of all the world, I put him to manage of my state. And at that time, I was the Duke, but I really didn't care so much about governing. I was really more into the liberal arts, he says. Those were all my study, and I left the governing to my brother as a result. So he kind of abdicated his power, he admits. Um, but his brother took control and really felt like he couldn't securely rule without getting rid of Prospero and Miranda. And so he, uh, he behaved like he was the Duke. His ambition was growing all this time. And Prospero finally says to have no screen between this part he played and him he played it for. He needs will be absolute Milan. Me, poor man, my library was dukedom enough. Of temporal royalties he thinks me now incapable. Confederate, so dry he was for sway with the king of Naples, to give him annual tribute, to do him homage, subject his coronet to his crown, and bend the dukedom yet unbowed, alas, poor Milan, to most ignoble stooping. So what happened was that he used the support of the king of Naples, that's Alonso, to oust his own brother from power, and in return he offered allegiance to Naples and agreed to pay a tribute to Naples and all that sort of stuff, which puts Milan, these were all city states, in a lesser position of power. So that's kind of a questionable decision on Antonio's part. And so meanwhile, uh, he schemes to send him away, Prospero and Miranda, and he uses the army from Naples and all the support to oust Prospero, and the only reason they survived was that a well, he says that his people loved him so much that they would not, set a mark so bloody on the business, but with colors fairer painted their foul ends. In few, they hurried us aboard a bark. So the few people that supported him bore us some leagues to sea, where they prepared a rotten carcass of a butt, not rigged, nor tackle, sail, nor mast. The very rats instinctively have quit it. There they hoist us to cry to the sea that roared to us, to sigh to the winds whose pity sighing back again did us but loving wrong. And so then he's basically got a baby on this horrible, half of a boat that they've just sent him off. Um, and she says, well, how did we even survive? How came we ashore? And he says, by providence divine, some food we had and some fresh water, that a noble Neapolitan, that from Naples, Gonzalo, out of his charity, who being then appointed master of this design, did give us, with rich garments, linens, stuffs, and necessaries, which since have steaded much. So of his gentleness, knowing I loved my books, he furnished me from mine own library with volumes that I prize above my dukedom. And she says, would I might ever see that man. Now we know all these characters he's been talking about are on that ship. Alonso, Antonio, Gonzalo, who were all part of the ousting of Prospero. And Prospero explains, here in this island we arrived, he became her schoolmaster, he tutored her, he he loves her, everything he does, he says he does for her, and he says that's enough. Now he's told her enough of the story. He puts her to sleep, right? He gets her to fall asleep. And then we meet the first of his, in his head, spirit, and that is this character, Ariel. We can talk in class about who we think Ariel is, but Ariel is really the spirit who causes all these things to happen. And so Ariel created the tempest. Hast thou, spirit, performed the tempest to point the tempest that I bade thee? To every article, says Ariel. He did everything. He made the waves tremble. He made the lightning. He made the trident of Neptune shake. And he explains everything that happened. Now listen, so he didn't allow, though, the people to die. He separated them. He landed the king's son, Ferdinand, someplace on the island, and nobody was harmed, and everybody's clothes are like as fresh as they were when they started. He put Antonio, Sebastian, Alonso, Gonzalo together. He put Ferdinand at another place on the island, and he says, yes, Ferdinand I left cooling of the air with sighs in an odd angle of the island, sitting his arms in this sad knot. And then the mariners are stowed away on the ship, which has been repaired. And then there are a few kind of servants wandering around the island. So Prospero is very happy with all of this, but Ariel says, is there more toil? Is there more to do? Do I have to do more work? And since thou dost give me pains, let me remember thee what thou hast promised, which is not yet performed me. Prospero says, how now, moody? What is it thou can demand? Ariel, my liberty. Prospero, before the time be out, no more. So now we have Ariel does not work out of the goodness of his heart. He is basically enslaved to Prospero, and Prospero will go through this explanation of why that's so. So he has a time. He's maybe not a slave. Maybe he's like an indentured servant. Before the time be out, no more. Ariel, I prithee, remember I've done thee worthy service, told thee no lies, made no mistakings, served without grudge or grumblings. Thou didst promise to bait me a full year. So you're supposed to let him out. And then Prospero has to remind him, dost thou forget from what a torment I did free thee? So what's happened is that the island, when Prospero and Miranda were trapped on it, was actually inhabited by a witch named Sycorax and her son, Caliban. Sycorax was born in Algiers, and she was exiled from Algiers, banished. And they said for one thing she did, they would not take her life. She had been full of mischiefs, manifold, they said. Um, but we think perhaps that she was pregnant with Caliban, and that's why they decided not to kill her and put her on the island. When she got to the island, left by the slaves, left by the sailors, she took Ariel, who you will note, Prospero says right here, my slave, um, as thou, my slave, as thou reports thyself, was then her servant. And for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act her earthy and abhorred commands, refusing her grand hests, she did confine thee by help of her more potent ministers, and in her most unmitigable rage, into a cloven pine, with which rift imprisoned thou didst painfully remain a dozen years. So 12 years he was imprisoned, and it was only uh, when Prospero arrived on the island that Ariel was actually released. He also has Caliban, his son, and he says, dull thing, I say so. He, that Caliban, whom I now keep in service, thou best know what torment I did find thee in. Um, it was a torment to lay upon the damned, which Sycorax could not again undo. It was mine art, when I arrived and heard thee, that made gape and the pine and let thee out. And so Ariel is kind of like reduced to thanking him again, and he threatens him. Prospero threatens him, I'll put you back into that oak again, and you can howl, away however many more winters. And so Ariel kind of backs off on this questioning, but that's important to know about their relationship. Prospero then says, after 2 days I will discharge thee. You wonder how long that's gone on, kind of. But Ariel says, well, what shall I do? So he asks Ariel to come back as a nymph. He then wakes up Miranda, and we meet Caliban. Caliban is a very interesting character. He's an indigenous person on this island, or, well, certainly predates Prospero. He has aspirations to ruling. He has the most beautiful language in the play. He also curses Prospero because Prospero treats him badly. When Caliban curses Prospero, Prospero says, for this be sure tonight thou shalt have cramps, side stitches that shall pen thy breath up. And he says he'll do all sorts of things. Caliban says, I must eat my dinner. This island's mine by Sycorax, my mother, which thou takest from me. When thou camest first, thou strokest me and made much of me, would give me water with berries in it, and teach me how to name the bigger light and how the less that burn by day and night. And then I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren place, and fertile. Cursed be that I did so. All the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bats, light on you, for I am all the subjects that you have, which first was mine own king. And here you sty me in this hard rock, whilst you do keep me from the rest of the island. So already we're in the second scene, and we've got all these issues of liberation, slavery, colonization, and kind of like an imperial actor taking over a place that isn't really his. Um, Prospero has this opinion about Caliban, thou most lying slave, whom stripes may move, not kindness. I have used thee, filth as thou art, with humane care, and lodged thee in mine own cell, till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child. And Caliban says, oh, would it have been done, thou didst prevent me. I had peopled else this isle with Calibans. This is a really important moment that I want to come back to when we talk in class about the moment that this play is written. 1613 is not that far from the founding of Jamestown. If you and 6 years before the first African slaves come to America. So anyway, so Miranda also jumps in this idea of like, how do you colonize people? What techniques? You see this kind of like, we tried to be good to you, we tried to teach you to be just like us, but then you were violent and we had to be violent back to you. This kind of narrative. We're going to talk about that in class. So Caliban says, you taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The red plague rid you for learning me your language. That is a line I will want to come back to and think about in class. Um, so, you get the tension between them. He sends Caliban away. And Ariel, meanwhile, has brought back, dressed as a water nymph now, has kind of, by singing, lured Ferdinand back. And Ferdinand, he's hearing this music. To the people who land on the ship, they think that the island is full of music and magic, and it's kind of, he can't tell whether it's coming from the air or the earth. But he follows the music. Um, he also hears this song, "Full fathom 5, thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell. Hark now, I hear them ding dong bell." It's this weird kind of subconscious voice that he's hearing that makes him remember his drowned father. He assumes his father's dead and that he is now the king of Naples. So Prospero actually shows Miranda Ferdinand, and she thinks he's a spirit. It's the first time she's actually seen another person. She says, depending on how the play sets up thinking about Caliban. She says, I might call him a thing divine, for nothing natural I ever saw so noble. And then Ferdinand sees Miranda. Her name means most wonderful. And he is smitten with her. She's a wonder. And he's in, totally love at first sight between the two of them. He can't believe she speaks his language. He says, I'm the best of them that speak this speech, were I but where 'tis spoken. So he's a little bit of an ego there. He feels he is the king of Naples, assuming his father is dead. Prospero is happy at this match, but he also wants to keep them kind of at a distance. So he puts Ferdinand to work. And he has Ferdinand carrying logs to and fro, and working hard on the island. And Miranda is kind of following him. And you see this, like how peremptory and sort of dictatorial Prospero can be when she pleads with Prospero not to like treat Ferdinand to in too ill a manner. And Prospero says, what I say, my foot, my tutor, like she would tell me what to do. Put thy sword up, traitor, who makes to show, but darest not strike. Thy conscience is so possessed with guilt. Come from thy ward, for I can here disarm thee with this stick and make thy weapon drop. So he's like getting feisty with Ferdinand. And he says, silence, one more word shall make me chide thee, if not hate thee. What, an advocate for this impostor? Hush, thou thinkst there's no more shape such as he, having seen but him and Caliban? Foolish wench, to the most of men this is a Caliban, and they to him are angels. So you leave them in this kind of tense moment, but he says, well, I'll work hard to make your father, admire me. And Miranda says, look, this is not my father and usually the way he is, so let's just try to take a deep breath and move on. And so Prospero has says to Ariel again, I want you to you know, do what I ask you to do. So meanwhile, Antonio, the brother of Prospero, the king of Naples, Alonso, Sebastian, his brother, and Gonzalo, they're all stuck on the island. Gonzalo is sort of a blowhard. They make fun of him. You start to see sort of the negative qualities of Sebastian and Antonio here. They're sort of like betting on who will speak first. They make fun of Gonzalo. Um, and I'm just going to skip ahead. What you ultimately have happen is that Antonio and Sebastian find that at one point the Prospero or Ariel, using Ariel, has everyone fall asleep but the two of them. And talking together, Sebastian and Antonio plot actually to kill Alonso because if they get rid of Alonso, then Sebastian can be the king of Naples, and who would know, what happened to him. So they decide that they have to kill actually Gonzalo as well because he's probably the only one who would actually say something about it. So they talk to each other and they conspire to the point where they are holding the knives over Alonso and Gonzalo, ready to kill them. And it just as they're doing that, Ariel enters with music and song, and it wakes up Gonzalo and everyone. So upon waking up, they're startled by the music and everything, and they kind of can't tell that there's this conspiracy going on, but it thwarts it. But now as an audience that these two, Antonio and Sebastian, are scheming together. So then they decide to go off and try to see the rest of the island. This Act 2, Scene 2 is Caliban, who is just grumping around because he's afraid he's going to be pinched. And it's like Prospero has some magic ability to give him cramps and pains and just cause him to fall and trip and be pricked by things and have snakes come at him. So he's sort of moaning about this as he's collecting the wood for the fire. And he sees these two come along, Trinculo and Stefano. They are sort of middling level servants on the ship, servants to, Antonio, Sebastian, and Alonso. And Trinculo is kind of a clown character. So Caliban hides under what they call a gabardine, but a big kind of sheet. And Trinculo comes in and he's wandering around, hasn't been able to find anybody. And he says, "Here's neither bush nor shrub to bear off any weather at all. And another storm brewing. I hear it sing in the wind. Yond same black cloud, yond huge one, looks like a foul bombard that would shed his liquor. If it should thunder as it did before, I know not where to hide my head." And he looks down at the ground and he sees Caliban, who presumably has the thing over his head, but maybe a leg or sticking out or something like that. And he says, "What have we here? A man or a fish, dead or alive?" "A fish. He smells like a fish, a very ancient fish-like smell, not of the newest, poor John, a strange fish. Were I in England now, as once I was, and had but this fish painted, not a holiday fool there would give me a piece of silver. There would this monster make a man." So he's talking about kind of sideshows, right? Any strange beast there makes a man, but that's a pun, kind of, right? Like on The Englishman, people would have laughed about that. So he says, "This is no fish, but an islander that hath lately suffered a thunderbolt." So then he recognizes him as a person. "Alas, the storm is coming. And so there's no other shelter about. Misery equates a man with strange bedfellows. I will shroud till the dregs of the storm be past. So he crawls under Caliban's cloak. In comes Stephano. Stephano is singing and drunk. I shall no more to sea, to hear I shall die ashore. This is a very scurvy tune to sing at a man's funeral. Well, here's my comfort. And he drinks again. So he found the casks of wine, and that's all he's been doing is wandering around drinking and keeps saying, I'm singing this. Well, that's a scurvy tune, and here's my comfort. So he stumbles upon Caliban in his stumbling, drunken way, and he thinks they're devils, and he's a little disoriented, and he can't figure it out because there are too many limbs coming out from under this gabardine, and he assumes that it's some kind of animal, and he says there's some monster of the isle with 4 legs who hath got an ague. Where the devil should he learn our language? I will give him some relief if it be but for that. If I can recover him and keep him tame and get to Naples with him, he's a present for any emperor that ever trod on neat's leather. And Caliban, is kind of, don't torment me and don't jump on me. Anyway, what happens is he ends up pulling out Trinculo and discovering that it's Trinculo. Trinculo says, I should know that voice. It should be, but he is drowned, and these are devils. Oh, defend me. So they think each other's dead, but then when they find each other, oh, the joy. And also Trinculo discovering that Stephano has liquor makes him even happier. And Caliban likes these two. And he decides, he says, these be fine things. And if they be not sprites, that's a brave god and bears celestial liquor. I will kneel to him. And so Stephano actually starts feeding liquor to Caliban. Caliban decides he can use Stephano and Trinculo to plot against Prospero. He thinks he'll get these two to help him, and he kind of sucks up to them to do that. And every time he drinks, he says, kiss the book, and Caliban kneels before him. Trinculo thinks this is ridiculous, and he is not a big fan of the way that Caliban is kind of like fawning over Stephano. So there's a little bit of a tension there between them. Caliban says, I'll show thee the best springs, I'll pluck thee berries, I'll fish for thee and get thee wood enough. A plague upon the tyrant that I serve. I'll bear him no more sticks, but follow thee, thou wondrous man. And Trinculo says, a most ridiculous monster to make a wonder of a poor drunkard. And Caliban says, I prithee, let me bring thee where crabs go, and I will dig with my long nails thee pig nuts. I will show thee a jay's nest, and instruct thee how to snare the nimble marmoset. I'll bring thee to clustering filberts, and sometimes I'll get thee young scammels from the rock. Wilt thou go with me? So, Stephano is very enamored with this idea, and they all go off together and crying, ban, Caliban has a new master, get a new man. And he's looking for freedom through Stephano and Trinculo. All right. So Ferdinand has been patiently carrying logs around. He is in love with her, but she is 10 times more gentle than her father's crab, and he's composed of harshness. But he does the work, and she wants to advocate for him. And you get the sense that they are kind of a match, and Prospero sees this, and she says, she's not supposed to talk to him, but she kind of tells him her name, and this has broken the rules. And he says, oh, admired Miranda, indeed the top of admiration worth its dearest to the world. Full many a lady have I eyed with best regard, and many a time the harmony of their tongues hath into bondage brought my too diligent ear. For several virtues have I liked several women. I don't know why he goes into telling her how many women have liked him or he's liked. But anyway, he finally says, "But you, oh you, so perfect and so peerless, are created of every creature's best." She says, "I do not know one of my sex. I don't even know what a woman looks like. No woman's face remember, save from my glass mine own. Nor have I seen more that I may call men than you, good friend, and my dear father." Um, so, but she thinks he's the perfect companion. And so he says he'd like to give her his hand. She says, "Do you love me?" And he says, "I do. I promise I will love and prize and honor you." And, and, uh, they agree that they will marry. And Prospero is glad of this. I cannot be who are surprised withal, but my rejoicing at nothing can be more. I'll to my book, for yet ere supper time must I perform much business. So you get the sense that he's okay with it, even though he wanted to make it a little bit difficult for them. Um, Meanwhile, Caliban and Stefano and Trinculo are wandering around the island, drinking now. Stefano is calling Caliban his servant monster. And everybody is sort of a little bit drunk. My man monster has drowned his tongue in sack. And Stefano is feeling more and more confident about himself. And what happens is that, Trinculo is sort of undermining this. He kind of can't tell. He doesn't like the way, Caliban is sucking up um, to Stefano. Ariel, in the meantime, sort of pretends to be Trinculo talking, which causes a little bit of a fracas between Caliban and Stefano and Trinculo. Um, and um, and Caliban lays out this plan for them to overthrow Prospero. He says he got the island by sorcery. From me he got it. If thy greatness will, revenge it on him, for I know thou darest, but this thing dare not. Um, he says, "Thou shalt be lord of it, and I'll serve thee." And he says, "This is what we're going to do. I will take you to his cell, and when he's looking at his books or when he's deeply asleep, we will dash his brains in, and then we'll take over the whole island." So that's his kind of like his plan. It's pretty violent. He says, "There thou may sprain him, having first seized his books, or with a log batter his skull, or punch him with a stake, or cut his weasand with his throat with a knife. Remember first to possess his books, for without them he's but a sot, as I am, nor hath not one spirit to command. They all do hate him as rootedly as I. Burn but his books. He has brave utensils, for so he calls them, which when he has a house he'll deck withal. And that most deeply to consider is the beauty of his daughter. He himself calls her a nonpareil. I never saw a woman, but only Sycorax, my dam, my mother, and she as far surpasseth Sycorax as greatest does least." And so then they plan that Stefano's going to marry Miranda and rule the isle, and they'll have killed Prospero. Okay, so they are plotting. Meanwhile, um, Alonso and Gonzalo, they're all exhausted. Alonso's very sad. He thinks he's lost his son. And out of nowhere, a banquet appears. And this is Prospero bringing in this banquet with all these strange shapes. And they decide they should eat. They think they might be islanders or something like that. But they very quickly turn into harpies, right? Harpies are these kind of like, um, sort of women, horrible female heads with wings and talons and everything, just as they move towards the table. And Ariel, who is one of the harpies, says, "You are three men of sin, whom destiny hath no instrument to this lower world, and what is in it, the never surfeited sea, hath caused you to belch up on this island where man doth not inhabit, you mongst men being most unfit to live. I have made you mad. So he starts to drive them crazy, and brings in these ministers of fate, they're called. He reveals that you three from Milan did supplant good Prospero, exposed unto the sea, which hath requited him and his innocent child, for which foul deed these the powers, delaying not forgetting, have incensed the seas and shores, yea, all the creatures against your peace. Thee of thy son Alonso they have bereft, and do pronounce by me lingering perdition worse than any death can be at once. So it's kind of like putting a curse on them, and then Ariel vanishes. So Gonzalo is, they haven't all heard the information the same way. And Gonzalo is like, what are you standing there staring about? And then Alonso says, oh my God, I heard the name of Prospero. Um, and you know, you get the sense that they're all guilty now. And Gonzalo says all three of them are desperate. Their great guilt, like poison given to work a great time after, now begins to bite their spirits. I do beseech you that are of suppler joints, follow them swiftly and hinder them from what this ecstasy may now provoke them to. So this is Prospero's kind of revenge plot, right? Um, so Prospero eventually says to Ferdinand, I give you my daughter. You've stood the test of all these, you know, trials that I gave to you. I give this her as my rich gift. Oh, Ferdinand, do not smile that I boast of her, for thou shalt find she will outstrip all praise and make it halt behind her. Um, and he says, you know, now listen, don't break her virgin knot before all sanctimonious ceremonies. And in order to do that, to keep them sort of apart and occupied, he sets up he's going to set up a beautiful a sort of wedding mask for them. And so he has them sit together, and these goddesses come in: Iris, Ceres, the goddess of bounty, and Juno, who's the goddess of marriage, to sort of bless their union, right? So this is where we think maybe this was part of a wedding, because this big elaborate wedding mask, and I will talk about with you about what masks were. Shakespeare didn't write many of them, but a lot of people at the same time were writing these. Um, and it's just a sort of the language gets more complicated here. It's kind of a lot of inverted um, syntax. It's a kind of discussion between these three goddesses about why they've come there and what kind of blessing they're going to do. Venus does not arrive, by the way, but the more sort of like bountiful, marriage oriented goddesses come. And at the end of this, there are these sunburned sicklemen who are these sort of like reapers of the wheat, and they have these hats on them, and they've come. And some, for some reason, now in some productions, actually, Caliban is one of them, shows up as one of them, but it reminds Prospero of this confederacy, this conspiracy against his life. And so he's got to kind of break up this party and go see what is happening with those conspirators. So he calls an end to this performance, to this wedding mask, this very famous speech here on, I think we're in 4-1 Act line 165. Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, we're all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherent shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Sir, I am vexed. Bear with my weakness. My old brain is troubled. Be not disturbed with my infirmity. So this is like a kind of a famous speech because it seems to articulate what theater is, right? This insubstantial pageant, this thing that's fleeting. Um, but then, Shakespeare being Shakespeare has this reverberation that it's also what, life is fleeting. Um, so Prospero, when he goes to deal with the drunkards, Stefano and Trinculo, he tempts them with this gorgeous clothing that he has them come in. Caliban recognizes that this is a trap, and just as soon as they sort of get close to Prospero's cell, they're distracted by putting on all these attractive clothes. And then all these spirits come in as dogs and hounds and chase them, with Prospero and Ariel having them be hunted. Um, okay, so we got rid of the conspiracy of Caliban, and now Prospero's project gathers to a head. He says Ariel is bringing everybody together. The king, his brother, and yours abide all three distracted, and they're all sort of, mourning over them. The good old Lord Gonzalo, his tears run down his beard like winter drops from eaves of reeds. Your charm so strongly works on him that if you now beheld them, your affections would become tender. Dost thou think so, spirit? Mine would, sir, were I human. What is Ariel then? And Prospero says, and mine shall. So this is where we have this kind of redemptive moment where Prospero is going to forgive them. Okay, so it is ultimately a play of forgiveness. He says, the rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. They being penitent, the sole drift of my purpose doth extend, not a frown further. Go release them, Ariel, my charms I'll break, their senses I'll restore, and they shall be themselves. And now where we get some real magic. He draws a big circle on the stage. He calls out the elves of hills, brooks, standing lakes, and groves, and you that on the sands with printless foot do chase the ebbing Neptune, do fly him when he comes back, you demi-puppets, that by moonshine do green sour ringlets make, whereof the ewe not bites, and you whose pastime is to make midnight mushrumps, that rejoice to hear the solemn curfew, by whose aid, weak masters though you be, I have bedimmed the noontide sun, called forth the mutinous winds, and twixt the green sea and the azured vault set roaring war. To the dread rattling thunder have I given fire, and rifted Jove's stout oak with his own bolt. The strong promontory have I made shake, and by the spurs plucked up the pine and cedar. Graves, at my command, have waked their sleepers, oped and let 'em forth by my so potent art. But this rough magic I here abjure, and when I have required some heavenly music, which even now I do, to work mine end upon their senses that this airy charm is for, I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book. So that some people read as some people have read it as a kind of farewell to the stage, but we'll talk about this in class. There's more to be said about that speech. So we bring out all these characters, and basically at the end of the play, Prospero reveals that that actually, Ferdinand didn't die, that Ferdinand and Miranda are going to marry. The king Alonso accepts this. And they say that Prospero will be restored to his position as the Duke of Milan, which he's really not interested in. He says he'll come back with them, but every third thought of his shall be for his grave. So you get the sense that he's sort of towards the end of his life, that he's completed this sort of cycle of revenge and redemption. Um, and he forgives even his brother. So it's a great, a play of about sort of how does somebody forgive the worst, and so in the end, um, just to get you to the end, one of the very last things that Prospero does is he releases he has to release his servant Ariel. Ariel says, "Wast well done," and Prospero says, "Bravely, my diligence, thou shalt be free." And he says, "Come hither, spirit, set Caliban and his companions free, untie the spell." So Caliban and Trinculo and Stefano are let go. Um, he says, "Two of these fellows you must know and own," meaning Stefano and Trinculo, "but this thing of darkness I acknowledge mine." People have wondered about that line, what that means exactly. Caliban fears I shall be pinched to death. Um, and he says, "Go, Sirrah, to my cell, take your companions. As you look to have my pardon, trim it handsomely." And then he regrets kind of, "What a thrice double ass was I to take this drunkard for a god and worship this dull fool." And they go away. And finally to Ariel, he says, "My Ariel chick, this is thy charge. Then to the elements, be free and fare thou well." Then he says, "Please you draw near." And the play ends with this epilogue, which is Prospero on stage by himself. "Now all my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now 'tis true, I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell. But release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free." And that passage takes a very kind of religious diction towards the end there, religious terms about mercy, prayer, indulgences, even. So we can talk about that. What is that turn at the end of the play? They are away from the magic to something maybe more religious sounding. Okay, I've talked long enough, and I'll see you in class on Tuesday.